Introducing the keynote speaker for today, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Hand from Birmingham University. And so there's a lot of acolytes in the bio that is online. I want to start with the most important thing. Michael is getting married to Laura in a couple of days, so yay. Sorry, Laura. I cleared it with Michael, but I threw you under the bus, so it's okay. So, apart from that, so Michael is professor in philosophy of education and university director of postgraduate research at the University of Birmingham. He's vice chair of the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain, so our sister society on the other side of the planet. He's editor of the Bloomsbury Philosophy of Education book series and co-editor of the Journal of Philosophy in Schools. Michael works primarily on moral and political, religious and philosophical education, and he has also an interest in education against extremism, relationships and sex education, and autonomy and flourishing as educational aims. There's a couple of other things online, but I think that's the most important because it relates to your presentation today, Michael. And so please welcome Professor Michael Hand onto the stage.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge Nai Tuahuriri as the people of the land. I'd also like to thank PESA, and in particular the conference organising committee, for this very generous invitation to come and speak to you this morning. It's my first time on the South Island. It's absolutely stunning. This is a beautiful building, a beautiful city, and a beautiful country. I'd like to say that this morning's keynote will be the high point of my visit to New Zealand, but given what's happening next week, I can only say it's in the top 2. So my topic this morning is education, extremism and exemption from basic morality. I've been writing about the relationship between education and extremism for a number of years now, along with Laura and some of our PhD students at the University of Birmingham. There's an excellent special issue of educational theory that came out last year with a first set of papers on education against extremism. So do have a look at that. And this is my most recent work on this topic, which I'm presenting here for the first time. So the fundamental question that I'm interested in is, are there things schools can and should do to build pupils' resilience to extremism? Interest in the idea that there are has been gaining ground in recent years in many countries across the world. It's not self-evident that this is an area that schools should be involved in. It's quite controversial to say that it is part of the remit of educators to try and do something about the problem of extremism. But I want to try and be positive about that suggestion. I want to suggest that there are indeed things schools can and should do that are absolutely within our normal remit as educators, and which I do think will help in the endeavour to counter extremist beliefs and attitudes. So just a little bit of the international context. So first in the UK, where I'm based, some of you may have heard of the Prevent Duty. So in the UK, the 2015 Counter-Terrorism and Security Act imposes a duty on schools to have regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. It isn't just a duty that's placed upon schools, it's a duty that's placed on more or less all public services and bodies, that we have this duty to do what we can to prevent terrorism. The statutory guidance on implementing this duty in schools requires schools to build resilience to radicalisation and extremism, and to ensure that staff have sufficient training to be able to recognise susceptibility to terrorism. That's obviously a big ask, so many schools now have annual training for staff on the Prevent Duty and what it is they're being asked to do. And Ofsted, which is England's school inspection agency, now judges schools on the extent to which they enable pupils to recognise the risks of radicalisation and extremism. I'm not sure if New Zealand has an equivalent organisation to Ofsted, but it's a sort of central national body that goes around doing spot inspections of schools across the country and awards them a grade depending on how well they're getting on. And one of the things they look at now is the degree to which schools are successfully building resilience to extremism. I think the UK has probably gone a little bit further down this line than most other countries, but many countries now have counter-extremism strategies and some sense that this is something that schools should be involved in, that we as educators have a role to play in. So here in New Zealand, I'm sure many of you will be aware of the Christchurch Call. In the wake of the 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern and Emmanuel Macron issued the Christchurch Call, which gives educators an explicit role in counter-radicalisation. So part of that call reads as follows. To that end, we, the governments, commit to counter the drivers of terrorism and violent extremism by strengthening the resilience and inclusiveness of our societies to enable them to resist terrorist and violent extremist ideologies, including through education. Building media literacy to help counter distorted terrorist and violent extremist narratives. So I think here in New Zealand, as well as in the UK, there's some sense that this is an activity that schools should have a role to play in. And then finally, in Australia, there are a number of initiatives under the banner of Countering Violent Extremism, or CVE. So in Australia, the CVE program, coordinated by the Department of Home Affairs, seeks to combat the threat posed to all forms of violent extremism in Australia. And the early intervention strand of that program involves funding, mentoring, training, and education programs for young people that build resilience to violent extremist influences. So in the UK, under the Prevent duty, there's quite a lot of central government guidance as to what schools are supposed to be doing. I think there's less central government guidance here in New Zealand and in Australia, but there are certainly initiatives and funding streams devoted to what it is that schools might be usefully doing here. Okay, so as I've said, this is controversial. Asking schools to play a role in this activity is not without criticism. So there has been a great deal of scholarly criticism of these political initiatives. In the UK, much of the criticism has focused on what might be called the custodial part of the Prevent duty, which requires school to monitor changes in children's behaviour, to identify those at risk of radicalisation, and to refer them for external assessment and report. So part of the Prevent duty is that teachers should be monitoring and reporting children who they believe are vulnerable to or at risk of being drawn into extremism or terrorist groups. And of course, that's the part that has caused particular ire among scholars and educators who feel that it compromises their position as educators if it's also part of their role to watch and report to the police children who they think are behaving suspiciously. Other criticism has focused on the way extremism is defined. In the UK, the definition in force from 2011 to 2024 was vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values. That is, of course, a fairly hopeless definition of extremism. It's not at all clear that the fundamental values in question are in any meaningful sense British. They basically are referring to liberal democratic values. But in any case, any number of distinguished scholars and ordinary people have expressed at one time or another vocal opposition to liberal democratic values, and that isn't sufficient on its own to make somebody an extremist. So I think the existing definition, this has actually been updated earlier this year, but the new one is not much of an improvement, and it's much longer, so I'm not going to bore you with it right now. But there are problems with the way the government defines extremism, and there are problems with this watching and reporting brief, which I think we have to address. We can't just accept these directives as they stand. So I don't want to challenge these criticisms. Many of them, I think, are right on target. But I do want to ask whether there is nevertheless something to be said for the educational enterprise of building resilience to extremism. Perhaps if we can get clear enough about what extremism is and what might be involved in forestalling the acquisition of extremist beliefs and attitudes, we shall find that schools do have a legitimate role to play in counter-radicalization. So I see my contribution in this area as being not to add my voice to the many valid criticisms that have been made of this policy. There are all sorts of problems with it, and it does need to be radically overhauled, but to try and ask whether there is nonetheless something positive here, some worthwhile and educationally legitimate contribution to be made to this endeavour. Okay, so we're not going to have any further truck with the UK government's definition of extremism, but can we as philosophers do better? So the most comprehensive attempt to date to map the conceptual terrain of extremism is, I think, Quassim Cassam's Extremism, a Philosophical Analysis, which was published in 2022. Cassam is a philosopher based at the University of Warwick in the UK, and his book-length treatment of the concept of extremism is well worth a look if this is an area that's of any interest to you. Cassam contends that extremism has three dimensions or aspects. To determine whether or not someone is an extremist, Cassam says, we shall need to ask questions about their actions or their methods, about the content of their belief or their ideology, and about their way of believing or their psychology. So Cassam favours a multi-strand account of extremism, which typically will involve criteria in all of these three categories: methods, ideology, and psychology. The characteristic methods of extremism, he says, are acts of violence or brutality for political ends, which acts are not necessary to achieve those ends, are disproportionately harmful, or target innocence. The characteristic ideological commitments of extremism are those located at the far ends of political spectra. In particular, what he calls the left-right spectrum, that's the one we'll all be familiar with, the pro-violence spectrum, so here he has a spectrum of ideological views where there is strong endorsement of violence to achieve your political ends at one end of the spectrum, and a kind of extreme pacifism and an unwillingness to use violence for any reason at the other end of the spectrum. And what he calls the authoritarianism spectrum, the degree to which it's acceptable for governments to behave in highly centrally controlling ways towards citizens, versus at the other end, a more sort of anarchist understanding of society, which says there shouldn't be authoritative government, that's too much of an intrusion into people's lives. So these three spectra, he says, if you're at the extreme end of any of these three spectra, then you satisfy one of the ideological criteria of extremism. And finally, the area of traits that Cassam himself is most interested in, the characteristic psychological traits of extremism, and he lists them as follows. There are preoccupations with purity, virtue, and victimhood, emotions of anger, resentment, humiliation, and self-pity, attitudes of aversion to compromise, indifference to harm, intolerance and anti-pluralism, and ways of thinking that are conspiratorial, apocalyptic, and catastrophic. So Cassam's view is that extremism is what's sometimes called a family resemblance concept, which is to say there's no set of necessary and sufficient conditions that make someone definitely an extremist or not an extremist. Rather, there is a cluster of criteria under the three headings of methods, psychology, and ideology, and where a person satisfies enough of those criteria, then we accurately and legitimately describe them as extremists. So that's his view, a view to which I'm very sympathetic, although which I want to slightly modify this morning. What Cassam proposes then is a family resemblance account of the concept of extremism. The characteristic features he identifies are to be understood as conceptual criteria, none of which is necessary, but some unspecified combination of which is sufficient for correct application of the concept. The criteria of family resemblance concepts are, says Wittgenstein, like fibers twisted in a thread, and the strength of the thread does not reside in the fact that some one fiber runs through its whole length, but in the overlapping of many fibers. Now, of course, from a policy point of view, you can see why family resemblance concepts are fairly unappealing, because they're messy, they're indeterminate. It will often be a matter of judgment whether someone satisfies enough of the criteria to be counted as an extremist or not, although there will be many uncontroversial cases. There will be many people who don't satisfy any of the criteria of extremism who definitely aren't extremists, and some people who satisfy more or less all of the criteria who definitely are extremists, but then there'll be a whole bunch of people in the middle where it's simply unclear whether enough of the criteria have been satisfied. So it's a messy, family resemblance concepts are messy and irritating for tidy-minded people like me, but nonetheless, it does appear to be the case that that's what the concept is. If we descriptively analyze how the word extremism is used, it does seem to have this messiness about it. So I think we're stuck with a family resemblance concept. So how might we deal with it then? How might we deal with the messiness? If extremism is a family resemblance concept, our task, I suggest, will be to catalogue its characteristic features, and I think Cassam's done most of that work for us. Then ask of each in turn whether and how its acquisition might be educationally forestalled. For some features, there may be little schools can do to prevent them from taking hold. And for others, there may be things schools could do, but should refrain from doing, because doing them would violate the norms that govern the practice of education. But we should not assume that all or most of extremism's characteristic features will fall into these two categories. Perhaps a number of them are such that it is possible and permissible for schools to counter them. So we start with a list of characteristic features of the extremist mindset, and we ask of each individually, is this something it would be appropriate for schools to try and do something about, to prevent the acquisition of? And in some cases, we might simply think, no, it would simply not be possible for schools to do something, or it would be inappropriate because it would require forms of teaching that we're not prepared to accept. It wouldn't be an ethical form of teaching. So I'm entirely open to the possibility that it may be inappropriate for schools to attempt to forestall some of the traits of the extremist mindset, but I think we should consider the possibility that others, there is something schools can and should do. And in a previous paper, I've taken the criterion that Cassam calls aversion to compromise and suggested it is both possible and appropriate for schools to encourage a readiness to compromise, to try and combat this trait, forestall its development in young people. But this morning I want to take one of the ideological traits of extremism and ask about the possibility of forestalling that. So let's go back and look again at how Cassam understands the ideological part of the concept of extremism. So Cassam defends what he calls a positional conception of the ideological aspect of extremism. He says, if ideologies are viewed as occupying positions in ideological space, then an ideology counts as extremist because of where it is in ideological space. On this positional account, Khmer Rouge ideology was extremist because it was on the extreme left of ideological space, just as fascism is on the extreme right. So his picture is of these spectra in ideological space, and if we're positioned at one or other end of any of these central political spectra, we count as we have one of the traits of the extremist mindset. But I think we should resist that way of thinking about the ideological aspect of extremism. Cassam's positional conception is not wholly persuasive. Not all of the beliefs it is plausible to think of as characteristic features of extremism are to be found at the end of the suggested spectra. Take, for example, Robert Nozick's contention that it is a characteristic belief of extremists that somewhere in the world is an enemy who is absolutely evil, with no shred of right or justice on their side. So this is a short paper by Robert Nozick. It's in one of his collections of essays. in which he sets out what he takes to be the defining criteria of extremism. And one of these is this central belief, which I'm going to call the evil enemy belief. Now, that doesn't fit comfortably at the end of any known political spectrum, certainly not at any of the ends of the political spectrum that Cassam identifies as in his attempt to map ideological space. So I think there are at least some strong contenders for extremist beliefs that don't fit Cassam's picture. Moreover, the positional conception that Cassam favors forces us to treat as characteristic of extremism views that seem not to be. So the view located at the anti-violence end of the pro-violence spectrum is pacifism. But pacifists are not easily aligned with extremists. Cassam does acknowledge the awkwardness that his picture sets up in positioning pacifism as an extremist trait, but I think the problem is more serious than he allows, in that it's extremely unusual for people who identify as pacifists to have a sufficient number of the traits, the family resemblance criteria of the extremist mindset to be counted as extremists. And I, anyway, feel very little temptation to classify pacifists as extremists. So I think in part because Cassam's ideological conception misses some crucial extremist beliefs, and in part because I think some of the ideological positions that Cassam wants to count as extremist aren't, we need to modify slightly this aspect of his account. So it's tempting, I think, to take a more direct way with the ideological characteristics of extremism. I am inclined to say that the beliefs of interest here are distinguished simply by their content and not by their position in ideological space. So I think we should do away with this picture of all of these political spectra, and you're an extremist if your view lies at the end of one of these spectra. I think it's probably simpler and more accurate to identify the particular beliefs that are associated with the extremist mindset. So, for example, someone who holds Nozick's evil enemy belief thereby satisfies one criterion of the family resemblance concept of extremism, regardless of whether she stands at one or other end of a political spectrum. And here are three more beliefs that I think are strong contenders for defining criteria of extremism. These are identified by Gerard Saucier and colleagues as recurrent features of the thinking pattern of violent militant extremists, and I think we can construe them as conceptual criteria of extremism. First is the utopianism belief that it lays within the power of people to remake society and refashion human nature. Second is the exemption from basic morality belief. Those with the right, i.e. true beliefs and values, are entitled to use immoral ends, and I think the authors mean immoral means, if necessary to assure the success of their cause. And the harm of modernity belief. Modernity, including the consumer society, and even instances of successful economic progress, is actually a disaster for humanity. So the suggestion is that these four beliefs, the evil enemy belief, the utopianism belief, the exemption from basic morality belief, and the harm of modernity belief are actually the ideological criteria of extremism. Okay, so if that's right, and if our general procedure here is to take each of these traits in turn and ask about whether it's appropriate for educators to forestall them, then we're going to need to do that with each of those four beliefs. And this morning I just want to look at one of them, one of the four, the exemption from basic morality belief. So my interest is in what exactly is this belief, and are there things schools can and should do to prevent its acquisition by children, and indeed young people. So the core ideological commitment of extremism on which I should like to focus here is the exemption from basic morality belief. And I formulate that as follows. There is an ideal so worthy as to exempt those who pursue it from the requirements of basic morality. That is to say, there's some vision of the good that's so worthwhile that the pursuit of it justifies you in behaving in fairly grotesquely immoral ways in order to bring about your vision. So let me say a little bit about both ideals and basic morality to clarify a little further what I take this belief to involve. So ideals. By an ideal, I mean a picture of how things should be in this world or the next. And of course, there's a basic distinction between two species of extremism, one of whom are focused on this worldly transformation and one of which are focused on how things will be in the next life and how we can prepare for that. To have an ideal is a model of perfection against which to measure the world as one finds it, and towards the achievement or acquisition of which one is prepared to put some effort. Ideals vary considerably in their scale and scope. Some are mundane. Think of ideal homes, cars, meals, and holidays. And others are grandiose. Think of ideal societies, political systems, spiritual states, and cosmic orders. I'm not at all down on ideals, let me emphasize. Ideals are fantastic. I think we should all have ideals. Ideals are great. The point is not that we shouldn't have them, it's that they shouldn't be allowed to trump our basic moral obligations to others. By basic morality, I mean the foundational rules of interpersonal conduct that constrain the actions we are permitted to take in carrying out our plans and projects and pursuing our goals and ideals. So here I have in mind what J.L. Mackie and others call morality in the narrow sense. A system of a particular sort of constraints on conduct, ones whose central task is to protect the interests of persons other than the agent, and which present themselves to an agent as checks on his natural inclinations and spontaneous tendencies to act. So I think of basic morality as in the sort of the side constraint model of how morality works, that as we go about our various projects and activities, we are constrained in various ways by moral requirements. So there are things we can't do in order to bring about our ends. We can't kill people or steal their stuff or deceive them. So morality constrains us in various ways in how we go about our business. So for most of us, at least most of the time, pursuing ideals and subscribing to the standards of basic morality are not in conflict. Our moral standards set the parameters within which we are free to seek our fortunes, follow our dreams, and preach our gospels. But the characteristic thought of the extremist is this: while it is usually true that our pursuit of ideals is properly subject to moral constraints, it is not always true. Because there is at least one ideal so worthy, so infinitely precious, as to trump considerations of basic morality. So this is the motivating thought of the extremist mindset that interests me here today. Isaiah Berlin, in a famous paper called The Pursuit of the Ideal, describes this core belief. He doesn't describe it as a characteristic trait of extremism, but he's interested in this belief, in this exemption from basic morality belief. He writes, "For if one really believes that such a solution is possible, then surely no cost would be too high to obtain it. To make mankind just and happy and creative and harmonious forever, what could be too high a price to pay for that? To make such an omelette, there is surely no limit to the number of eggs that should be broken. That was the faith of Lenin, of Trotsky, of Mao, for all I know, of Pol Pot. Since I know the only true path to the ultimate solution of the problem of society, I know which way to drive the human caravan. And since you are ignorant of what I know, you cannot be allowed to have liberty of choice, even within the narrowest limits, if the goal is to be reached." So Berlin is extremely worried by this thought, but he thinks it's one of the defining thoughts of extreme political views. It was one of the most damaging and influential thoughts of politics. He was writing in the 20th century, and he saw that a lot of the harm that had been done in the 20th century was predicated on a belief of this kind, that there is some vision of the good, some ideal of society, which is allowed to override our basic obligations to one another. The exemption from basic morality belief, then, is readily intelligible, depressingly familiar, and patently dangerous. It is also not without rational appeal. Of course, in the end, I don't think its rational appeal is strong enough to justify it, but I think we ought to recognize that for those in the grip of this belief, it does have a kind of logic to it, that there is some end that's so valuable that quite a lot of sacrifice of other people's lives is worth making. But is it a belief that can be preempted and countered by educational means? Here, I think there's a question of principle and a question of practice. The question of principle is it permissible for educators to forestall the exemption from basic morality belief? That is to say, are we within our rights as educators? Is it consistent with what we're doing when we educate to try and prevent people holding this belief? And secondly, is it possible for them to do so? Even if we allow that it's educationally permissible, is it actually within the ability of teachers, given the current constraints of schooling and what classrooms are actually like, to try and combat beliefs of this kind? So the rest of the talk will be on those two questions. First is forestalling permissible, and then is forestalling possible. Okay, so to get to grips with the permissibility, I just want to lay out some assumptions I start with about what we can and can't do as teachers. So teaching of beliefs, I think, may be directive or non-directive. To teach a belief directively is to teach it with the aim of persuading pupils to accept or reject it. To teach a belief non-directively is to teach it with no persuasive aim. I think we have to make that decision about huge numbers of the beliefs that we tackle in the classroom. There are a bunch of beliefs where I take it we know they're true, and it's entirely appropriate for us to teach them as true, presenting the relevant evidence and argument to young people so that they come to hold those true beliefs. But there's also a whole bunch of beliefs that are controversial. We simply don't know whether they're true or not, and it would be educationally inappropriate for us to try and settle that question for our students. Rather, our obligation is to teach non-directively, to present these ideas for the children's own critical assessments, looking at the arguments on both sides. So decisions about whether to teach beliefs directively or non-directively should be governed, I have argued in other work, by the epistemic criterion, according to which a belief should be taught directively when the question of its truth or falsity is decisively settled by the available evidence and arguments. So I think that's a really central and defining principle for the project of educating others. We ought only to be in the business of persuading people to hold beliefs where the evidence and argument in support of those beliefs is rationally compelling, and where it isn't, where the matter is open, then it has to be taught as open. The attempt to forestall the exemption from basic morality belief is an exercise in directive teaching, right? We are finding ways to convince children that the exemption from basic morality belief is in fact false, and we're trying to persuade them not to adopt that belief. Well, then that's directive. Since teaching is only permissible, such teaching is only permissible if the exemption from basic morality belief is in fact demonstrably false. So we would need to show that we have compelling reason to reject that belief before we could be entitled to forestall it or prevent its acquisition in young people. That the belief is dangerous, or that it is a core ideological commitment of extremism, is not sufficient grounds for the educational attempt to prevent its acquisition. If there is an argument that decisively rules out the possibility, so the question is there an argument that decisively rules out the possibility of there being an ideal so worthy as to exempt those who pursue it from the requirements of basic morality? That is to say, we would have to show that epistemically this belief could not be warranted, rather than simply showing that the belief is dangerous or undesirable in some other non-epistemic way. Now, one promising line of thought here is that any ideal potent enough to rival the authority of morality will turn out, on closer inspection, to be incoherent. So this is Berlin's thought. Berlin thought he could defeat the exemption from basic morality belief by demonstrating that the posited ideals were themselves internally incoherent. So he says, the notion of the perfect whole, the ultimate solution in which all good things coexist, seems to me to be not merely unattainable, that is a truism, but conceptually incoherent. I do not know what is meant by a harmony of this kind. Some among the great goods cannot live together. This is a conceptual truth. We are doomed to choose, and every choice may entail an irreparable loss. So those of you interested in Isaiah Berlin will know that he took a position which he called value pluralism, where he asserted that there were multiple really important central values in human life, and they often came into conflict. So the very notion of a perfect world in which all of our ideals cohere and we're able to live consistently according to all of them, he said that that's just a kind of nonsense, that the nature of human values is such that we will inevitably be, the values will come into conflict, and those who adhere to those values are bound to come in conflict with each other. They're bound to disagree with each other on many important matters. So he held his notion of value pluralism to show that there could be no ideal of the kind the extremist hopes for, in which all of society's problems are solved and everybody lives peacefully and harmoniously forever, and there's no disagreement about what should be done. That, he thought, is just not a coherent aspiration for human beings. Tempting though this is, I do not propose to follow this line of thought. It is not clear that we are rationally constrained to be Berlinian value pluralists. Perhaps, after all, there is a way of ordering or prioritizing our ends and values so as to eliminate discord. Perhaps the ancients were right about the unity of the virtues, or the utilitarians about the commensurability of goods under the metric of utility. I don't want to take a position on any of this, on the question of whether our values are ultimately compatible or incompatible. I think it's a really interesting and deep philosophical question, but I don't think we could say it's been settled one way or the other. I think the Aristotelians and utilitarians are two examples of philosophical positions where there is an attempt to show that in the end it does all cohere and we can flourish or lead, maximize happiness in a way that we're not constantly being brought into conflict among our values or among ourselves. So I don't want to follow Berlin down that line because I think it's too contentious. Happily, there is another more compelling argument available. The argument is this: there can be no ideal so worthy as to exempt those who pursue it from the requirements of basic morality, because the currency in society of basic moral standards is a condition of the possibility of sharing and pursuing ideals. We have to recognize that establishing basic moral constraints is the precondition for the pursuit of ideals. So in our pursuit of ideals, we can't then ignore or set aside those basic constraints. The idea that the authority of morality might be outweighed by the worthiness of an ideal is wrong-headed, because human beings in social groups are only at liberty to propose, discuss, adopt, and work towards worthy ideals if they are already subject to moral constraints. So this depends in part on how one understands the moral constraints, so I will just very briefly indicate how I think the justification of morality works. I've written a book called A Theory of Moral Education, which is excellent and available in all good bookshops, in which I set out this theory in more detail, but I would just very briefly summarize the central thoughts here. A person's moral standards are those to which her subscription is universally enlisting and penalty endorsing, those to which she holds herself and others on pain of punishment. So by a moral standard, I mean one to which you think everybody should be held, and indeed that we should be in some way penalized or sanctioned where we don't hold ourselves to those standards. There are some foundational standards of interpersonal conduct to which all of us have reason to subscribe in this way. And the reason we all have is that general compliance with these standards is necessary to solve the problem of sociality. The problem of sociality arises because of three contingent but permanent features of the human condition. These features are sometimes described as the circumstances of justice, and they are rough equality, limited sympathy, and moderate scarcity of resources. The circumstances of justice are discussed by many political philosophers throughout history, and they what they purport to show, and what I think they successfully show, is that human societies are such that there's a sort of inbuilt predisposition to our coming into conflict with one another and to breakdowns in our cooperative schemes. And for that reason, we need codes of morality and indeed codes of law to hold ourselves to agreements and to treating one another decently. The clear implication of these circumstances taken together is that there is in human social groups a standing propensity to outbreaks of conflict and breakdowns in cooperation. So to solve this problem, we need a supplementary kind of motivation for keeping to cooperative agreements and treating each other in non-harmful ways. We need, that is, the kind of motivation that universally enlisting and penalty endorsing subscription to standards can provide. The basic moral standards justified by this argument include prohibitions on killing and causing harm, stealing and extorting, lying and cheating, and requirements to treat others fairly, keep one's promises, and help those in need. I hope that that list of basic standards will look pretty familiar and uncontentious to you, because if the argument's right, then it's necessary for social groups to have these constraints in place if they are to continue to function as social groups at all. So basic morality in this sense is a precondition for social groups existing and surviving. So if this is right, the problem of sociality must be solved before we can set about sharing and pursuing ideals or models of perfection. Prior to perfecting the world, or even beginning a conversation about perfecting the world, we must achieve a base level of social stability. We must create social conditions that enable us to sustain cooperation and hold conflict at bay. Because that is the precise purpose of morality, at least in the narrow sense, our subscription to basic moral standards must precede and trump our pursuit of ideals, whether grandiose or mundane, earthly or next worldly. So I think that's a compelling reason, and a sufficiently compelling reason, to reject the exemption from basic morality belief and to teach children that that belief is false. Now, I'll come back to the question of how we might pedagogically teach children that that belief is false, but the point here is to show that we are justified in forestalling the exemption from basic morality belief because it isn't rationally sustainable. This general line of argument, this way of showing that the exemption from basic morality belief is not rationally sustainable, is outlined in a really interesting paper by Peter Strawson from 1961, and he writes, "It is obvious that many, if not all, of the ideal images of which I spoke demand for their realization the existence of some form of social organization. The demand is in varying degrees logical or empirical. Some ideals only make sense in a complex social context, and even in a particular kind of complex social context. For others, some complexity of social organization seems rather a practically necessary condition of the ideals being realized in any very full or satisfactory way. Now it is a condition of the existence of any form of social organization, of any human community, that certain expectations of behavior on the part of its members should be pretty regularly fulfilled, that some duties, one might say, should be performed, some obligations acknowledged, some rules observed." So Strawson sets up the distinction between morality and ideals very much in the way that I've defended here. So to demonstrate the falsity of the exemption from basic morality belief, we need not invoke the Berlinian thought that grandiose ideals are incoherent. Instead, we can remind ourselves of the justification for subscription to basic moral standards, which shows that meeting our moral obligations is a condition of the possibility of sharing and pursuing ideals. Insofar as this demonstration is sound, the educational project of forestalling the exemption from basic morality belief in pupils is at least permissible. Okay, so on to the final question, which is forestalling possible? We've said that we are educationally entitled to forestall it, but is it actually within our power as educators to do so? Are there considerations, that is, of a practical kind that make this an unrealistic educational goal? I think two worries suggest themselves, and I call them the intellectual demand worry and the backfire effect worry. According to the first, the intellectual demand worry, the argument against the exemption from basic morality belief may be too intellectually demanding for school-aged children. And according to the backfire effect worry, for pupils already in thrall to some religious or political ideal, the argument may be experienced as a threat and met with psychological resistance, resulting in increased susceptibility to the problematic belief. So the idea of the backfire effect is you'll have the exact opposite of your intention. If you try to tell somebody that their ideals must be subordinate to their moral obligations, you will so offend and upset them that they will become more deeply entrenched in the opposing idea. So the intellectual demand worry first. It is of course true that philosophical arguments about the respective weight of ideals and obligations are beyond the comprehension of the average 5-year-old. But a great many of the things we routinely teach in schools are too abstract, technical, or complicated for young children. When thinking about the content of the school curriculum, the question we must ask is not what children are capable of understanding at the outset of their formal education, but what they are capable of understanding by the end of it. So in relation to this worry, I simply want to say, yes, of course, we have to take into account the capacities and maturity of the children we're teaching, and we're not going to get into complex moral philosophical arguments with children in primary schools, or at least in the early years of primary schools. I was actually a primary school teacher, and I did involve my primary school children in quite complex moral philosophical arguments, and they did great. But nonetheless, of course, there's practical judgments here, pedagogical judgments about the point at which children are capable of engaging in this kind of thinking. But I think it's absolutely, there's nothing in this argument that's more complicated than many of the things we teach in mathematics or physics or geography. There's no reason why we cannot bring teenagers to understand the logic of the position that I've set out. And then finally, what about the backfire effect worry? Instances of beliefs being strengthened by debunking are not nearly as common as popular articles on the topic might lead one to suppose. So firstly, the backfire effect has been grossly exaggerated. Brian E. Swire-Thompson and colleagues suggest that backfire effects are not, in fact, a robust empirical phenomenon. Still, it is by no means implausible to think that insofar as attempts to forestall are experienced by pupils as threats to cherished ideals, they are unlikely to be successful and may even be counterproductive. The solution to this problem is not to give up on the enterprise, but rather to be aware of the danger and take active steps to mitigate it. When illustrating the havoc caused by the pursuit of ideals without moral constraint, teachers should try to avoid examples involving the particular ideals held by their pupils, at least in the first instance. So this is just what I think is a sort of sensible precaution if we're going to dive into this domain and try and show why the obligations of basic morality must take priority. Don't pick the ideals to which you know your students are already passionately attached and are going to feel all defensive about if you start to try and make this argument. Take ideals at one remove from the children's own existing commitments to illustrate the point, and then let them do a lot of the figuring out of what follows then for their own commitment to ideals. And then relatedly, while some exposition is probably necessary, teachers should make extensive use of such non-didactic methods as open discussion and pupil-led inquiry in acquainting pupils with the argument against the exemption from basic morality belief. So the thought here is this kind of teaching will not be particularly effective if it's as I am now, standing in front of a room lecturing at you. That's probably not how you persuade children of the cogency of any kind of argument. Rather, to get children talking and thinking and working in groups and discussing and coming to understand for themselves through their own rational powers why it is that morality in the end has to trump their ideals. Okay, I have argued that the educational enterprise of building resilience to extremism is broadly defensible, that a core ideological commitment of extremism is the belief that there is an ideal so worthy as to exempt those who pursue it from the requirements of basic morality, and that forestalling this belief by educational means is both permissible and possible. So it's my contention that any comprehensive program of education against extremism should give explicit attention to this task. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this very interesting, and I really appreciate the logic that you bring into your argument and the detail that you explain difficult concepts. Thank you very much. It was really enlightening. We have time for questions. If I can invite you to step to the microphones, and first question is coming up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was thinking in another worry. My thought comes from a theoretical framework, so it's evidence-based, and it's about that Western modern civilization and the educational system that we have now, that it's grounded in this contract, social contract, and that, and it's an exemption from basic morality belief, because modern society is grounded over genocide, colonialism, epistemicide, and ecocide, and patriarchy. So the root of our educational system is based on an exemption from basic morality belief. Because modern society is built over the idea that since the very early colonial times, that, okay, they are not human, so we shouldn't pay them, and then we have all the wealth for us, and then we construct our big society, and then we generate even the social contract and education of the Emil that says that you have to forget your culture for me to teach you everything, and that because I'm going to show you and teach you real knowledge. So that is an exemption from basic morality belief also.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So it's a really interesting thought. Maybe some of the ills of liberal democratic societies, and there are many ills of liberal democratic societies, of course, maybe some of them can be traced to some kind of exemption from basic morality belief. That's, I would have no problem rejecting the beliefs if they were used in defense of liberal democracy any more than I would have a problem with objecting to them if they're used in defense of terrorist attacks. So I agree that if and insofar as aspects of Western society are predicated on an exemption from basic morality belief, then those are aspects we should be challenging and critiquing for exactly the reasons I set out here. It's simply that in this particular project, the starting point was that extremism is one kind of social problem that schools might do something about and attempt to get to grips with some of the characteristic ideas of extremism. But the fact that those ideas appear and pop up in other contexts and other political systems, which we may or may not want to describe as extremism, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be any less resolutely opposed to those beliefs than if they were in the mouths of an extremist.
Yeah, thank you. That's why my worry is about incoherence between the educational system and teaching about exceptions from basic morality, maybe changing the ground aspect of educational system.
Right, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Kia ora, hello. Thank you for a very engaging talk. I am interested in your understanding of how the analysis of extremism might be grounded in a particular cultural locatedness, or how definitions and therefore characteristics of extremism is located in particular social constructions and cultural locatedness, and therefore what are the grounds or the opportunities for intercultural communication on those characteristics. And that was going to lead me into a question around what your thoughts are about the relationship to early childhood education. But I was surprised to see that you said that potentially children under the age of 5 might not be engaging in that sort of rational thought. So we might have conversations about that later. Christoph's laughing because I'm the early childhood person that stands up and says those things. But it'd be really great to talk. But I'm interested particularly about the cultural locatedness and the social construction of this analysis and therefore subsequent analyses.
Great, thank you. So just on the second point first, yes, my background is also primary schools, and I briefly suggested that I have attempted philosophical discussions of various kinds with primary school age children, and they are extremely receptive and highly capable. So I absolutely don't mean to downgrade the cognitive capacities of young children. I'm simply allowing for the possibility that there will be certain kinds of philosophical argument that are probably going to be inappropriate for the youngest of school-age children. I think this is a matter for pedagogical judgment and the teacher and knowing their own class and when they're ready for certain kinds of ideas of certain kinds of complexity. But I'm certainly open to the idea that children much younger than we commonly suppose can engage in this kind of thought and in these kinds of discussions. Yeah, on the cultural embeddedness of the particular conception of extremism, sure, that may well be true. It might be that extremism is differently conceptualized in different societies and different parts of the world. In the end, I don't think that's going to make too much of a difference to the normative recommendations I want to make. So what I've tried to do is show that extremism on at least one familiar, ordinary conception of it, which is what I take Cassam to have unpicked, involves these characteristic thoughts and attitudes. And then my question is, well, which of these characteristic thoughts, attitudes, preoccupations are ones we might legitimately tackle by educational means? So if it were the case that some other society defined extremism in a different way and didn't include some of the thoughts and attitudes I've mentioned here, in the end that's not going to matter too much, because the normative question is, can we seek to forestall the development of these beliefs and attitudes or not?
Kia ora, Michael. I'm juggling a couple of balls here, several questions all at once. Dan O'Reilly's book on misbelief was parked up there, and Robert Sapolsky's one about determined is over there. But I'm thinking in terms of the developments towards AGI and the way Tesla cars are trained for their auto drive thing. They wouldn't recognise a stop sign because it's not built into the training data. They recognise it by the millions of hours of what people do as the vehicles approach a stop sign. In the same way, could you see a future where our extremism is taken care of in the same way as a stop sign by the AGI making decisions as to what we are exposed to in our normal interactions with others and the media?
No. I mean, look, I'm not in the business of wild sci-fi speculation about the future, but I don't think anytime soon are we going to be in a situation where it is AI rather than teachers and children that we need to be thinking about here. What matters at the moment is how children come to form the beliefs that they come to form, and at the moment that's under the influence of their parents and teachers and peers. I don't think we are yet at a place where AI is doing the teaching or the moulding.
Sam Altman would disagree with you. He predicts
Sure.
next year, and Ray Kurzweil is 2029. But I think in terms of preparation for that, thinking through the philosophical aspects.
No, absolutely. I'm not at all resistant to other people thinking through those implications. I just haven't begun to come to grips with what any of this might mean for AI teaching models down the line.
Thank you.
Can I ask the two last questions to both be posed and then Michael to respond so that we can go after that? Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Sarah Talbert from University of Canterbury. And I just wanted to, I think, take up some of the points that Andy and Caro have made. I'm just wondering, because of the way in which counter-extremism is actually employed as a political tool, and often a tool of oppression, for example, a tool of Islamophobia, but a tool of state-sponsored oppression. I come from, before I was in New Zealand, I was in Arizona for almost 8 years, where the idea of counter-extremism was used to dismantle the ethnic studies program because they were teaching, for example, pedagogy of the oppressed, and that was, and by some of these criteria, I think would qualify as extremist education. And so I guess my question is how
about the extent to which we can really disentangle the development of extremism and how we label extremism from the socio-political context in which this extremism emerges, and how do we disentangle extremism from what would some argue is actually a morally grounded response to state-sponsored oppression, and in such cases is teaching things like compromise complicit with that oppression.
Great, thank you.
Hello, thank you for the talk. It's kind of connected to what has already been said, but I guess I have a different view of this. Would you consider democracy to be an ideal that can be exempt from basic morality? If we think about the way that a certain vision of how governance should work in certain nations has been pushed, namely here democracy, would you consider that to be something that is exempt from basic morality? And do the same rules that apply to members of a society apply to nations as members of a global society? Because to me, it's not that these systems are predicated on extremism, but in my view, I see it as a continuing project of extremism. By the definitions that you presented, to me, that project is an extremist project. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So to take the second question first, I think if anybody was proposing to pursue an ideal of democracy at the cost of basic morality, that would be unjustifiable for the exact same reasons as any other ideal vision. That, again, ideals are not bad. It's good that we have ideals, and democracy is a great ideal, and we should approximate to it as best we can in political systems. But no, not at the expense of basic morality. Basic morality, if the argument is right, trumps the pursuit of any ideal, including the pursuit of democracy. In relation to the first question, so I did at the start of the paper try to acknowledge, but perhaps not forcefully enough, that many of the criticisms of these counter-extremism policies are absolutely justified and valid. I quite agree that they have been used in problematic and oppressive, and continue to be used in problematic and oppressive ways. So this is absolutely not supposed to be a blanket defense of everything that's being done in the name of counter-extremism at present, but rather an attempt to say, given that there are so many problems with what's being done under the banner of counter-extremism, can we interrogate a little bit more deeply what are the particular beliefs and attitudes we are classifying as extremist, and is it the case that we are justified in educationally forestalling any of those beliefs and attitudes? And there may be some that we are simply not. It would be simply inappropriate for schools to try and forestall those. But I do think there are some beliefs and attitudes that it's entirely appropriate for schools to forestall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you very much for your keynote.
Thank you very much.